WorldKiller. So I can think of one other game where I quit in this kind of situation where it wasn't a matter of, I don't know, I may be wrong, but where it was really the game itself was just too miserable for me to continue on with, without really saying, wow, um, the game's a bad game in and of itself, or the situation is just, clearly decided or is stuck in sort of a pathological situation that might be difficult to, might be impossible to extract yourself from. Things like Kingmaker come to mind for the latter case, where I could see quitting because I've played it enough times to know, I'm just playing out time at this point. We're not sure who's going to win, but it's not worth it anymore. Um, for this one, and the other game that comes to mind, I mentioned in the playthrough was on Chosen. The components and the mechanisms are such that they just make this too painful for me. So the first thing is the component is this map. This map is nowhere near large enough to hold all the information you need to hold on it. That's a complaint other people have raised. And the reason that it might not be that big a deal, it's still a pain in the ass, but it's not that big a deal because there aren't a whole lot of counters in the game. I mean, this is the whole set. You could see you had, I don't know, maybe like a dozen ships on a side or something, but the representation was just horrible for it. A larger map with more space to hold the ships in each cube that they're in would have made a lot more sense. That's step one in terms of making this unplayable. Step two is very personal, which is that the game is one about geometry. You really have to be able to view what is happening in the three dimensions from the two-dimensional representation. I have regularly had difficulty with any games that do that. Generally, and I've picked up a few, that I have vague hopes for. Things like God's Fire that handles a three-dimensional representation with a spiral. That might work better for me somehow. This one, I could not tell the distances involved by glancing at the board. That's problematic. And it's especially problematic because the ranges on the ships are so small, and that's part of the design, that you're unable, you have to be able to grasp within a hex or two, right, within one or two movement point values, whatever. Just by looking at the board, you've got to be able to tell, can I hit this, can I not? That's hard to do in three dimensions. And to me, that's a barrier that makes the game very, very difficult. I'm not a fan of games that are geometry-based anyway. So, you'll look at some of the Avalon Hill classics. Africa Core comes in mind. There were places in that where the game is really about the geometric positioning. And, hey, am I the right number of hexes away that I'm threatening these two things? Another similar case was in Ancient Battles Deluxe. I felt like that was too much about the geometry. Being able to just recognize what the right place was. Now, Go is a game of geometry, and I at least previously loved Go a great deal. Never was very good at it, but I loved it. Because, well, in part because it's purely abstract, right? When you get to a game where it's about geometry and it's about something that it's supposed to be representational, I want the representation to be the lead story in the game, and it's not in this case. In this case, all of my effort was being spent trying to figure out how far away something was. That's not helped by the fact that this little true distance table is not complete. It needs one more chart on it, and I explained that. There really isn't a workaround other than building that extra chart. You could do that without too much difficulty. It's very obvious what it needs to be. It basically runs from 0, 0 on the XY axis, i.e. the distance between the two is between the two x positions ranges from 0 in the x-axis and 0 on the y-axis, which you need because you need to be able to compare it to the z-axis as well. Now, is that actually necessary? Yeah, because you need the xy of 0 to match with the 1 through 6 on the z-axis. Now, you could invert one of the axes and get things to work maybe, but that would require a lot more thinking and a lot more effort, I think, than just projecting out that other table during play. And there's already enough pain in this game. Beyond that, the game definitely has luck in it, so it's not quite the chess-like representation that I feared that it was going to be. I thought it was going to largely just be, yeah, you can pretty much predict what your damage is going to be and slap in there. But I don't think it is that simple, and that part of it is kind of appealing to me, the non-chess aspect of it, the fact that there is a fair amount of randomness in the combat, that you do have to maybe be a little flexible in your reactions to your opponent. You can't just count on, well, he's making this attack, I can make this defense in sort of a, so you set up your initial defense, the attack is made, and then you have reactions, and to me that felt like a tower defense type thing, which is really almost a puzzle game. I'm not sure this is that much of a puzzle because of the amount of randomness that's in it. You could see a lot of variance in terms of the amount of damage that's done, and that takes away one of the big negatives that I had about it, actually. But the cost of dealing with that three-dimensional geometry, the cost of dealing with this map, between them made this virtually unplayable to me. And when you add in the fact that, I'm getting these painful headaches, this is not helping them at all. I might have had a little bit more tolerance to cope with this at other times in my life, even in times when I was making videos. But at this point, there just isn't time to cope with this thing. What's kind of interesting about it is every Simonson design that I look at, I'm trying to think, Empires of the Middle Ages is maybe the exception. Many of them, I walk away from thinking, wow, there's a really interesting idea here, but something's really, really flawed. When we get to his game designs. What's also kind of strange is when you get to his game designs, what he's trying to do, the components, which are usually his shining point, right? This very simple representation of the information that you need to play the game, whether it's just plain pale colored hexes with a little bit of really important terrain, which worked so well back in the 70s, or some of the other designs that he's put together. Empires of the Middle Ages definitely qualifies for this, where the information just comes at you so easily. It's easier to process than it normally would be. When you start getting away from, when you get into his own designs, the graphical display of the game tends to not work for me. If you're looking at things like Sorcerer, for example, man, I can't make hide nor hair of that game when I'm trying to play it. And this is a similar type of thing. It's like maybe, maybe it works for some people. Maybe the ability to see the distances in this works for some people. Maybe the ability to see all those color relationships just sort of intuitively works for others. For me, it would require basically devoting myself far too much to these kind of to one particular representation of one particular game to kind of get that view, and that's not where I'm at. That's never been where I've been at when we're talking about little one-off weird games. I don't know how many people could be on that place, but yeah, this one would require way too much effort for something that just doesn't seem like there's enough game there. It's possibly a prototype of a huge system that could have come out of it if people could grasp that three-dimensional thinking. But again, it doesn't really add that much. All it's doing is adding, depth. And you still have a fairly flat map, right? So what you have, you don't have a cube of space. What you have is 12 spaces in this direction, 7 in this direction, and 7 up and down. It's close. It's closer than most games that try to do 3 dimensions. Most of them, will have like maybe 3 to, if you're looking at like a hex map, there'll be hundreds of hexes. There'll be maybe, 30 by 20 by like 5, This one at least comes close. It's a big rectangle or a big box, because it's not really a rectangle. I don't know what the term for a 3-dimensional rectangle is. That's odd. I should know that term, I think, but I can't remember ever having heard one. Box. Yeah. So, but it's, it's got as much depth as it does width, and a little bit more length. So that's not that bad compared to most games that try to represent 3 dimensions. On the other hand, my brain just doesn't work that way. I can't view a position within a box. So, this could be, I've seen a map of this where it's spread out so that each of these squares, instead of being divided into +1, +2, +3, -1, -2, -3, is actually set up into little squares there. But even that is not going to translate into my brain as to the up and down nature of where these things are. And I just find myself having a really hard time ever kind of visualizing what's being tried when an attempt is made to represent 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional space well. Like I said, maybe Attack Vector can do it better because it's got little stacks. I know that I, used coat hanger wire when I did airplane minis, and at least in terms of visualizing that worked. In terms of like actual playability, it didn't work so well because you really had to kind of tape measure to the point the plane was at to the next point and like bend it to get into the right position. It wasn't like, hey, the base is where you're measuring from. No, you got to actually measure from the actual plane, and that was difficult. And then with Attack Vector, you're handling like a full 3-dimensional representation, so you're handling facing within the directions as well as vector thrust or vector movement in that 3 dimensions. And jeez, man. But yeah, this I just did not have. I do not have the time and the brain function left to be able to cope with trying to finish it. And my patience ran out. And so I'm not rating it well. Maybe you could get so the best you could get out of this for me is a playable version where you're not, where the map is not a mess, where it's still going to be difficult to visualize what's where, and it's still going to be hard to count the distances. You're not going to be able to just look on the map and see they're 3 hexes apart or 3 squares apart or whatever. When you're looking at the cubes, because it's in 2 dimensions, it's just not going to work very well for me. What might work, some of the big companies, Milton Bradley, I think, was the one who did Subsearch, which was basically you could move the ships around, but it was basically Battleship with submarines in it on a multi-level board. But that was only 3 levels high. Here you'd be looking at 7 different levels. You'd be looking at basically a huge thing, and you'd have to reach in with tweezers to move your pieces consistently. You might be able to create access spaces through it. But again, is it worth it? I don't know that you gain that much through the 3 dimensions here. I really don't. And that's the big sell of the game. But when you're not talking about, that whole pitch and yaw and vector of movement being different from the direction that you're facing and all kind of stuff like that, you're not really talking about something that needs those 3 dimensions in as much of a way. What you end up with here, I think, could be almost the same game in 2 dimensions. The only difference being that you couldn't pack your ships quite as tightly, which is a deal for the way the defenses work and everything. There's some clever little things. How do I feel about like the pulsed movement thing? You pick a ship and you either fire or move it. I feel like that's a burden I don't really like. Right? In the same sort of way that I don't like the burden of the visualization. It creates something which allows you to kind of abstract a little bit of the, hey, everything's moving at once or whatever, without having to come up with complex simultaneous movement or pulsed movement type situations. And with the jumps and whatnot, it all kind of works, but it's not quite believable in the sense that, like, yeah, I chose that this ship would fire first. One ship fires before the other, whatever. It all kind of works, but I feel like I'm expending brain power on making my decisions of which ship is the vital one that I have to get my first shot off on, rather than, again, the story developing, where the story should be about, that's kind of a chance thing, not really something that I should be gaming out. Which leads me to, something like a chit draw solution or something as being better if I'm going to be dealing with something like that. Of course, that takes away some of the reasoning and some of, the gaminess. Being able to make that choice. You're making a choice that I don't know makes sense within the story. Something the commanders on the field probably can't make. What you're actually and certainly there's significant game effect decisions to the choice, but they don't feel like decisions that any individual or group think even is capable of making. It's not like you're not giving orders of, well, you guys all hold your fire until he fires, and then one of you can fire next, and then it just doesn't work that way, right? That's not a realistic presentation that makes sense to my mind. You could make up a universe where something like that maybe makes sense, but I don't feel like that's what Simonson's attempting to do. I feel like he's attempting to cut corners on, in terms of making a more difficult and meaningful gameplay decision out of something that no real intellect is making the decision on. And to me, that's pretty much the definition of gaming. Which is often the case, I feel, with Simonson games. I feel like I'm making choices that just don't feel natural in too many cases. Anyway, not my style of game, and too badly implemented to be worth pursuing at all. Kind of glad I picked it up. I'm sure I got it fairly cheap, although not as cheap as I would like, because I'm pretty sure I also had it shipped to me, which means I got it for more than, the $5 or so that it's probably actually worth to me to have had it. But it was the first Ares, and I felt a definite, it was definitely missing from my collection. Just like Wreck of the Pandora, I felt very glad when I got a copy of that given to me. All right, up it goes for whatever it's worth. Which ain't much. There's other people who say better things about it, I'm sure.